Hi everyone. I would like to invite you to join us this Wednesday at 11 o'clock as we begin a brand new Bible study on Paul's letter to the Romans, one of the most influential books of the Bible, both in Paul's own day as well as our own. Now, whenever we study the Bible, it's important that we think about at least three different worlds: the world behind the text, the world in the text, and the world in front of the text. What does that mean? Well, the world behind the text is the history. What was going on in the culture? What was going on in Paul's world? What was going on in the lives of those to whom Paul was writing? This history, this context, can give us great insight into understanding what Paul's words meant at the time. Secondly, the world in the text is basically what Paul actually wrote. What words did he use? How did he structure his argument? And then what did those words and argument mean to the first hearers of this letter 2,000 years ago? Finally, the world in front of the text is probably the most difficult to recognize, because the world in front of the text is the 2,000 years of human experience and human existence that have transpired since Paul first wrote his letter. Think about how much our world has changed. Think about how much our worldview has changed. And we can't help but hear and interpret Paul's words through the lens of our own cultural context and our own worldview. So let me offer a few reflections by way of introduction using these three different worlds as we prepare to gather together on Wednesday and study this important letter. First of all, the world behind the text. This is one of 7 letters in the New Testament that we are fairly confident Paul himself wrote. He likely wrote it fairly late in his ministry, around the year 57, 58 AD. We think he wrote it from the city of Corinth and then sent it by messenger to the city of Rome. We have good evidence to suggest that this messenger was a deacon named Phoebe, and we'll take some time to reflect on the role of Phoebe in Paul's ministry. Interestingly, this is a letter that Paul wrote to a community that he himself did not establish. In fact, we don't think he had ever even visited Rome before he wrote this letter. So he was writing to a community that he didn't know very well, if at all. And finally, it's a community that was likely made up of both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and that will affect the way we hear and interpret Paul's words. Now, the world in the text. This is probably the most sustained reflection from Paul on Christian theology and Christian thought. As I said before, it's the longest of Paul's letters, and it covers a wide range of topics, including God's righteousness and God's justice. It includes big topics in Christian theology like grace and sin and baptism and resurrection. It helps us understand Paul's thinking behind the Old Covenant law, the Old Testament law, and the purpose of that law in Christian theology. What does it mean to live by the Spirit? What does it mean to live in community as the body of Christ? What does it mean to be unified by love and in service to one another? These are all some of the topics that Paul addresses in this letter as he seeks to encourage and teach these Christians in Rome what it means to live by faith and to abide by the truth of the gospel. Finally, the world in front of the text. As I said, 2,000 years almost has transpired since Paul wrote this letter. And some of the imagery might be a bit shocking, such as the imagery of slavery and the way in which Paul uses that to describe Christian discipleship. The relationship between the empire and politics and Christian faith. Paul has some interesting things to say about that in the letter to the Romans. Since the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, this letter has been central to the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, and we'll talk about what that means and how that's beginning to change a bit in Christian theology. And finally, this letter has a lot to say about God's promises to the Jewish people. And so what does it mean for us to be in relationship with our Jewish brothers and sisters, even as we follow Jesus as the Messiah? So those are just some of the ways in which this letter will be a challenge and will be an opportunity for us to grow in our understanding of Paul, the early Christian movement, and our calling as the church today to continue God's mission in the world. So I hope to see you on Wednesday as we begin this exciting study. And read ahead. You can read chapters 1 and 2 of Paul's letter to the Romans as we gather on Wednesday. And I hope this will be an enriching time of study and learning and reflection as we continue this journey together. May God bless you, and I will see you all on Wednesday.